Yes, welcome to this session on post-capitalism and psychedelic colonialism with Alnoor, Ladha and Lynn Murphy, who are just doing some fantastic thinking around these topics. You're just very welcome to keep your videos on. I often find it's more engaging for the speakers to be able to see people's reactions and so on, but of course if you have reasons for not being able to do that, that's totally fine. So this session is well, inspired by at least Alnoor and Lynn's book Post Capitalist Philanthropy, and Alnoor also worked on this great article which was also linked in the event, why the psychedelic renaissance is just colonialism by another name. So the focus of this session is going to be on the more on the post-capitalism side than the philanthropy side, perhaps, of the book, in conjunction with the piece on the psychedelic renaissance, psychedelic colonialism. I imagine we'll probably touch on some of the content on philanthropy. It's hard to disentangle. But welcome, Alnoor and Lynn. And something that I've been struck by about the book and some of the sessions that I've seen you speak on already. I'm just going to meet someone here. Is that you start with a prayer, and I'm just wondering if you'd like to bring something like that into the space today, just to get us going.
Yeah, very wonderful. Lynn, do you want to open us?
I'll do what I recall from the prayer, and then Alnoor can add to that. And just thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you for those who are here with us today. And first, I just want to speak to where I'm sitting at the edge of the Talamanca Mountains up here in a place called Chiripo, which means place of eternal waters, and was a place that the Calacar people walked and tended for millennia and millennia. And the prayer that, I don't have the book in front of me to say the exact prayer that
I have it in front of me. If you want me to.
Okay, then maybe, yeah, speak the prayer, and may this serve, this prayer, this together today.
So I'll just amend it for our conversation. May this discussion serve the healing of all beings, including the fallen deity of money and its offspring, shadow and alibi, philanthropy. May the colonized mind and body be liberated, including our own.
Thank you very much, Alnoor. And since Lynn mentioned it, would you like to mention where you're speaking from today?
Yeah, I'm calling in from Tierra Valiente in the northwest jungle of Costa Rica, the traditional lands of the Malacu people. And we're about 2 hours from the Nicaragua border.
Nice, thank you. Okay, and for myself, speaking from southwest England in Devon, a small town called Totnes, that's a fantastic college, Schumacher College, that does all kinds of interesting courses on ecology and regeneration, and there's quite a spirit of these kind of ideas around these parts. Okay, so we've got a lot that we could be speaking about today, but the order of things on the event description was first the content on post-capitalism and then psychedelic colonialism. Does that feel like a decent order to go today?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
And we have like 90 minutes, or we have an hour?
We've actually built it until for 2 hours, but I think that
okay, great.
That we'll see how we're going. Like that would we might be that it feels right to wrap before then. Also reminds me that we have a Slido. So let me this is where you can suggest and upvote questions. That was in the confirmation email, but let me just share that before we get going.
Right. And then we'll save whatever 30 minutes or something for conversation at the end.
At least, yeah.
Great. And are you recording, Stephen?
I am, yeah. So the Slido, the Slido link is in the Zoom chat. So feel free to suggest and upvote questions there. I don't think there's been too much of that going on so far. So on that basis, I guess I'd just like to invite Alnoor and Lynn for you to start with, well, actually, let's start with the first question that we put in the event description, which is, how is the metacrisis, including ecological collapse, climate change, species extinction, increasing pandemics, institutional racism, rising authoritarianism, spiking inequality, and inhumane poverty, a logical outcome of our dominant economic, political, and cultural system? Because I think I would suggest for many people, it's quite a strong claim that those things are a logical outcome of our current system. So it'd be great to unpack that a little bit before we start looking about what might come after it.
Sure. Lynn, do you want to start that, or you want to?
I was actually going to see if you wanted to start that, and then I'll bridge us to how that then informs how we invoke post-capitalism. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Well, I think the first thing to look at is we have a debt growth-based system. That's what the economic operating system of neoliberalism is, and has been pre-neoliberalism. It's been this way since the 1500s, right? Money is printed at debt at 1%. That's almost universal now with the Federal Reserve style systems, fractional reserve style systems. So banks ask the equivalent of a Federal Reserve to print money. Then those banks lend that money out at roughly 2%, what we call prime. And so there's already a doubling of wealth, right? Creation, money supply. And then economists, the World Bank, etc., the orthodoxy says that growth has to exceed interest for money to be valuable, right? That's the economics 101 of the thing. So if the pie is growing at 2%, the money supply is growing at 2%, the growth of that money has to be 3%, right? And that's what we're told is the minimum. And on average, since World War II, we've been growing the global economy at whatever, 3.4% or something like that. So that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's the doubling of the global economy every 24 years. So just think about that, right? The double amount of Big Macs, Toyota Priuses, single-use plastics, Apple computers, Nike shoes, et cetera, right? And so that's the kind of like 1, 2, 3 of it. And then this kind of shorthand, I call it 1, 2, 3, 5. The 5 of it comes from Thomas Piketty's work, who's tracked capital over the last 250 years using econometric data. And he says that he shows and proves that capital holders have received a return of about 5%. So if the pie is growing at 3%, they're getting a disproportionate amount of the growth of the pie. So that's the 1, 2, 3, 5 model that neoliberalism is based on. So by definition, wealth creation creates inequality. Because if you have capital, you'll get an exponential return on capital. If you have debt, you'll be in exponential debt. It's therefore the logical outcome that inequality and poverty are the logical outcomes of capitalism. It's irrefutable axiomatic logic. It's not a strong claim. It's a weak claim in the sense of stringency of the claim from a logical perspective. And then we have a fossil fuel extractive-based economy. So every dollar of wealth created heats up the planet. There's undoubtedly a direct, strong correlation between climate change, ecological collapse, species extinction, degradation of the oceans, wildlife, and GDP growth. And so even just the fact that since 2008, about 93 cents of every dollar has ended up in the hands of the top 1%. The system is structured in such a way that capital holders will always receive more capital, right? We've just made up a bunch of rules, right? We've made up compound interest. We've made up things like capital gains tax. So hardworking, ordinary people are paying 30 to 40% tax. And if you are doing speculation on land and real estate, you're gonna only pay 15% or whatever it is in your respective country. Rich people don't pay tax, right? ProPublica recently did a investigative journalist report on the 10 richest people in the US. Their effective tax rate was around 1%. This is Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, et cetera, right? So they have an entire spider web of tax havens through the Cayman Islands and other British Crown dependencies. There's about $40 trillion plus sitting in tax havens. Global GDP is about $80 trillion. Now we're comparing stock and flow, but you can just get a sense of the vast scale of money that's not in the global supply, because 1%ers don't pay tax, corporations don't pay tax. The average corporation has 5,000 subsidiaries. They're selling staplers at a loss of $5 million to where they would pay tax, and then they're claiming their revenue in the Dutch Antilles or the Caymans or whatever. So the entire hardwiring of the system is such that what we see, the destruction around us we see, is the logical outcome of a set of rules that we can, for our purposes, call neoliberalism or late-stage capitalism or capitalist modernity.
Now, just to, to play devil's advocate a little bit, which is kind of difficult in a way to put myself in this position, but I think a couple of things folks on the other side of this debate might raise are, firstly, a kind of dematerialization of the economy. I'll say, okay, well, it's been, so far the economy's been very materials intensive, but going forwards, it's all just going to be bits and bytes. It's not like we might be able to double GDP without it necessarily doubling, or anywhere close to a doubling of physical resources. So curious for your thoughts on that. And then the other thing that came to mind is just this, well, a rising tide lifts all boats, and what people on the political right, generally more relaxed about growing inequality. As if we're being kind, we could say, like, as long as people are still being lifted out of poverty. So just I'm wondering if you got any thoughts on those two.
Mm-hmm. So maybe I'll say something on that, and then I'll let Lynn do some weaving. So the argument of green growth has been refuted completely, right? Like all of the projections on green growth are based on a lot of made up assumptions. And if you follow the work of Jason Hickel, I highly recommend his book, Less is More. And he goes into detail on this and takes a sort of wide swath of the research. But essentially, the rising tides argument, which is kind of central to neoliberalism, right? That if we just give tax breaks to rich people and 1%ers and so-called job creators, that somehow everyone will benefit from that, right? The evidence is clear that inequality is rising year on year. Oxfam has been doing great research since like 2014 on global inequality. When they first started their research, it was something like 300 billionaires had the same wealth as the majority of humanity, 50% humanity. Then that went the following year down to like 26, and then like 12, and now we're at like 8, right? And so every year concentration of wealth increases because of the way the system is structured. We know that billionaires have increased their wealth by about 30% since COVID. The system is structured in such a way that rich people will get richer undoubtedly. In terms of and we can get into the research on that, but it's unequivocal that that's not the case. Most of the tenets of neoliberalism have been proven wrong by the social sciences in the last 30 years, especially their belief around human nature and that we're red in tooth and claw, and all the sort of Hobbesian understandings of how humans live. But facts don't seem to change, and reality doesn't seem to change the ideology and the theology of neoliberalism. They continue to push their propaganda. And then in terms of just the green growth, we know that the safe sort of amount of consumption is about 50 billion tons of stuff every year. Everything from raw materials, livestock, mineral metals, etc. Everything we consume. We're at about 80 billion tons right now, so we're already at 60% overshoot. So in order for growth to be green and not life-destroying, we have to get back down to about 50 billion tons while continuing to grow GDP. And lots of modeling and the consensus in science has shown that at our current trajectory, we're going to hit 180 billion tons by 2050. So we're nowhere near going down in material consumption. There is no decoupling of GDP growth because we have such a materials intensive, fossil fuel intensive energy system. And now we can say that, well, we'll get more solar panels, etc. These things are not renewable. Nate Higgins, who's an energy policy analyst, sorry, can we mute Christopher? Great. Nate Higgins talks about these are rebuildable energies, not renewable energies. They require large amounts of fossil fuels in order to build them. You have to replace solar panels every 10 to 15 years. Electric cars take huge amounts of lithium. Cell phones take huge amounts of cobalt and coltan. We're hitting our material limits. We've crossed 6 of the 9 planetary bounds. So there's no way we can continue at our kind of current trajectory. So yeah, I think there's the sort of neoliberal orthodoxy and their propaganda, and then there's reality, and the two will not meet, at least in this material incarnation.
So the just before we move on to the kind of post-capitalism part, the next question on the that we had in the event description here were, what are the 5 philosophical tenets of neoliberalism? I mean, I don't think it's important that we name all 5, although you might like to, but just I was just curious how you describe neoliberalism as a kind of ideology or theology even. I just wondered if you wanted to speak to that a little bit more.
Lynn, did you want to say something before we do?
Yeah, just before that, I wanted to just say, like, at some level, Alnoor is describing where we are right now, and that capitalism, or what we call late stage capitalism or neoliberalism, has been a project that has been going on for probably, I mean, we could argue how long Wetiko has been around here, but let's just say in this current iteration, just close to about 1,000 years. And it was a very conscious effort to stamp out animate ways of living, being, and knowing, and that had to justify the extraction of and commodification of resources. It had to both render, like, dehumanize, so we could justify slavery, genocide, all sorts of things, as well as all of the commodification of goods, services, relationships, all of life. And so when I hear kind of these questions about, yes, but couldn't we still have more concentration of wealth, and the economy will shift, and AI and all sorts of the bits, it's not actually navigating and pointing towards these root causes of extraction and domination and thwarting of life force itself, and the commodification of all relationships, all perceiving the more than human realm only in the ontology of a resource to then have a transactional relationship with. And so part of what we're pointing to, and this will get to, perhaps Alnoor can elucidate some of those premises of neoliberalism and how we invoke post-capitalism. We're not just wanting to be in the, like, what's a better, like the new economy work that's trying to make capitalism more humane. We're actually trying to get to the root and say something's been up for a really long time that's giving rise to this current ideology of neoliberalism.
Well, before we return to Alnoor, then actually, Lynn, at the beginning of that, you mentioned Wetiko. I'm actually reading one of the books on Wetiko right now, and I'm finding it a really useful and powerful concept, but I imagine there's plenty of people here that won't be familiar with that. So I'm wondering if you'd like to just say a little bit about what Wetiko is.
I'll give the kindergarten answer, and then Alnoor can elucidate. He actually wrote a really beautiful article on this some years back with his, at that time, he was the co-director of the rules. Essentially, Wetiko says that, and this is where Alnoor and I look at the inner and outer structure of these normative, the ways that we have internalized capitalism, the way that we have internalized, in this case, Wetiko, the inner cannibalist within ourselves, the way that we ourselves, our very gaze by which we see the world around us, is one of domination and extraction. It is one that it's like we cannot get out of the gaze of colonization. We cannot get out of the gaze of seeing ourselves as separate, seeing ourselves individuated. And it's almost like the reason I say the inner cannibalist is, as the cliche goes, it's easier for many of us to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Well, what is it about that we have internalized so deeply And that we recognize, even as Alnoor and I invoke this notion of post-capitalism, we're still in checkmate. You know, like if I still am sitting here with my little Yeti, and working in systems that I recognize are extractive. And what I have to reckon with is where those thought forms live inside of me, and what is the shift that has to happen innerly to get out of the trap of Wetiko.
Thank you. Alnoor, anything we want to add on Wetiko before speaking about kind of neoliberal theology?
No, basically that, you know, it's an Algonquin word. It's used in many First Nations traditions on Turtle Island. Yeah, the Cree and Blackfoot and others had versions of it, and they used to use it as like the literal meaning of cannibalism. So a member of the tribe would be lost on their own and veer north, and then, you know, have to physically eat a human body to survive. And they would say two things would happen to them. One was that they would get this icy heart, and the second was that they would have this unnatural desire for the consumption of more flesh, even when they returned to a field of abundance. And when they first met the Western European colonialists and conquistadors, almost unanimously across the continent, they used this word to describe their approach, which was, you know, the consumption of the living world in order to satisfy never-ending fabricated desires that were, you know, culturally induced, almost a sort of trance-like destructive behavior. And which is why a lot of the conversation in the book, for example, focuses on culture. Because like, what is culture? It's a set of collectively agreed upon delusions. And there was a particular milieu of culture that came out of Western Europe from, you know, arguably, now we go into the history of this, and there's lots of contention on this in evolutionary and cultural anthropology. But, you know, some people will say that this version of how we live started after the last ice age, when we went into sedentary lifestyle and farming, so the Neolithic Revolution. Others will say it was the creation of city-states like Babylon and Ur and Uruk about 5000 BC, and the creation of ziggurats, you know, these structures that were the original human settlements in the Fertile Crescent, where as soon as there's a surplus of grain, that's the bottom floor of the temple, and then we invent the militia class, the police class to militarize and protect the surplus, the grain, what have you. And then there's the priest class on the third floor, which was the first invention of theology and religious institutional beliefs in order to create order. And then the Sun Emperor, the Sun King, and his family would be at the top of the ziggurat. And that's the kind of beginning of proto-capitalism and capitalist modernity. And then, of course, that then gets hugely accelerated with the merger of Christianity and empire in 400 AD through Roman conquest. And that gets even further accelerated through the invention of debt-based currency in the 1400s, and then imperialism, colonialism, so-called enlightenment in the 1500s and 1600s in Europe, and then sort of mass acceleration through industrial revolution. And so there's sort of different descriptors of when the psychosis started, or when its its major vectors were. I would argue that the beginning of colonization and globalization in the 1500s, which has already included the kind of Christian imperialist Wetiko logic, does get supercharged in the 1800s, and then has a kind of second supercharge after World War II and Bretton Woods and sort of modern globalization. And then when neoliberalism starts in the 70s, I think of neoliberalism as the latest chapter of capitalist modernity. So it's not separate, it's just the heir of proto-capitalism, colonialism, industrial capitalism, technological capitalism, etc. And so that's the kind of historical take. And then in terms of the tenets, because it is the heir in that sense, It is the snowball effect of 5,000 years of separation from the living world, and patriarchy and hierarchy and white supremacy and all of those things that, summarizing the tenets of neoliberalism, are also in some ways we are summarizing the tenets of modernity and capitalist modernity. And Lynn and I like the frame of capitalist modernity. It comes from Abdullah Öcalan's work. He wrote Manifesto for Democratic Civilization, a book we highly recommend. I can put a book list in the chat box after this. But the first, and the reason we call it a theology is because it covers all the major tenets of religious philosophy. And so the first, for example, is it has a very strong point of view on human nature, right? That humans are inherently selfish and competitive, and that if it was not for the state and markets, that we would essentially descend into some kind of anarchy and kill each other. And even though social science has proven that we are highly empathic beings, evolutionary anthropology showed that we lived in small hunter-gatherer tribes, large levels of cooperation within tribe at least, and yet, even though there's no basis for this, this was sort of a core part of Enlightenment and neoliberal logic. Milton Friedman and Robert Nozick and the kind of architects of neoliberalism were descendants of Enlightenment logic, undoubtedly. And so that's kind of baked in. And it's baked into the economic policies, it's baked into the ideas of trickle down, the enclosure of the commons, all of that is sort of wrapped into this idea. The second is that hierarchy is inevitable and necessary for order. So if we don't have hierarchy, an ideally white male Christian hierarchy of rational, enlightened people, that there would be no way to tame the savages. And so that was core to the colonialist, imperialist program, and it's core to the ongoing coloniality that we now have. The third is that the individual is the primary unit of power. That, the famous Margaret Thatcher line, there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals and families. Like they really believe the shit, right? And so everything from rational actor theory to modern microeconomics is based on this idea that we are these sort of rationalizing, optimizing machines. And the machine metaphor, starting from the Enlightenment onwards, is like core to the belief. And within that is, of course, the atomization of the various cogs that are apparently us, who are trying to compete and succeed within the model of acquisition and consumption. Which relates to the fourth, which is wealth determines success. It determines well-being, meaning, virtue. If you have money, you are somehow worthy, and if you're poor, you're somehow a moral failure, right? It's completely ahistorical. There's no lens on how we got into this current situation. It's just pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And then the last is the kind of cosmology and ontology of the thing, which can be described as separation, materialism, rationalism. So we're separate from the material world. The material world can be reduced to its constituent parts, right? Everything can be reduced to the atom to the neutron, the electron, the proton, and now with quantum physics, the quanta or what have you, right? But we're going to get to a theory of everything. And not only is that the kind of arrow of progress and the logical outcome, but we are entitled to rationally understand everything with the limited human mind, that this is somehow this inevitable march towards progress. So that's separation, materialism and rationalism, and that's really the core. And so people would say, well, these are not necessarily neoliberal, these are the premises of modernity. And again, what we would say is like, yes, and they've been inherited by neoliberalism and weaponized into political economy and policy.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm struck by just how far back you both kind of trace this story. Mentioning 5,000 BC, and you mentioned a city-state, maybe like the beginning of this cancer, as it's sometimes described, of Wetiko, and then a kind of early stage, and it's become more and more shall we say, well, its grip on us has become more and more strong over that period up until the present neoliberal day, and started what we might say in like the 70s, right? And then we're in this like very acute phase, this like terminal phase, perhaps now of this this illness that has had some a long progression, and maybe back in the day, it didn't seem so bad, but it's it was its influence on all of us and on this planet is now impossible to not see. So
and I'll just say it sounds long, but of course in geological time it's nothing, right? Like even the fact that human beings in our modern anatomical form have been around for 250,000 years, right? So if I stretch my arms like this, capitalist modernity is a sliver of my nail. Mm-hmm. And so it's not so long in certain ways, and you're right, like there was a point where the belief in unfettered capitalism and growth and the markets was not so delusional, right? Of course, there was the anarchist impulse of the 1800s and others who said you cannot continue to treat the natural world as if it's inanimate matter, and there was critiques of dualism from its inception in the 1500s, its inception as a kind of major tenet of the operating system. And by dualism, we mean, the separation between human and other, the separation between our mind and our body, the separation between the white Christian male at the top of the hierarchy and all of the so-called others of indigenous people, brown bodies, black bodies, female bodies. That there was always critique of this, and it wasn't the most insane belief within a certain ontology and within a certain lens, right? For Western Europeans, they were seeing the benefits of imperialism, colonialism, and slavery and genocide, and literally would argue that at some point the entire world would benefit from this colonization. And then, of course, when we enter the 1960s and we start understanding the limits of growth, and we start understanding the impact on the biome and ecological systems and earth systems, etc., that a mature civilization would take heed of that and take stock of that and have some kind of recalibration. But of course, given the immaturity and what the historical basis of that wetiko and that insanity was, it's impossible for this existing system within the confines of their worldview to shift the existing system. So when Lynn says, yeah, we're in checkmate, it doesn't mean that there's not options and possibilities to get outside of that. It's that the paradigm of power is not going to, it's like that Americanism where they say a turkey is not going to vote for Thanksgiving, right? We've sort of structurally created a system in which those in power are the largest beneficiaries of power. If you're getting 93% of every dollar, you're not going to change the system. And the way representative democracy and corporate power in neoliberalism work is that we are facing a totalizing behemoth. We are facing the Leviathan.
Something that I find particularly insane is that like rates of like mental illness, mental distress are significant amongst even the richest in our society. So it's like we create this system where the richest are hoarding all this wealth, and it's not even really making them happy. So I'm glad we've really taken some time to like face up to the problem, and having done that, maybe let's turn a little bit more towards not necessarily what comes after, because I mean, that's something interesting, an interesting distinction you make actually, or like you have something interesting to say about your use of language in that regard. But what could happen instead? Perhaps we can say it that way. So let's see. So the first, the question, and we put in the event description here, was what is post-capitalism, and what subtle distinction does the space in post-capitalism convey relative to post-capitalism? Lynn, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I can start with us on post-capitalism. So if capitalism is much more than a market exchange, but it's the very commodification, the very gaze of the way that we see the more than human world, the natural world, a set of relationships, basically our very way of how we interact with, is this my phone? Is this my land? If it's that commodification and ownership at the very deepest level. Post-capitalism, what we're referring to is a conceptual container of values that would be values such as altruism, reciprocity, kinship, solidarity, valuing life itself, recultivation with life force, gifting, a deep kind of a rising of what is equity consciousness, empathy. So it's a set of values that are that kind of co-arise within us and within our relations. And so as a conceptual container, and what we're trying to point to is, as you said, it's not, we're talking about old culture, new culture. We're not talking as much about a temporal state. We're speaking about this, like actually navigating this inner cancer of Wetiko and finding another set of values that are informing how we perceive the interconnectedness of all of life. Perhaps the second piece to say, as you were gesturing to, is we're using post-capitalism in the way that you might talk about postmodernism. It is a condition informed by the conditions of capitalism. And if you look at a lot of where we are with neoliberalism, or, I mean, we focused on philanthropy, there's a, we have a culture that fixates on innovation and what's coming, and, or you can even see it in all the films that are currently popular, or that were popular, with the fixation on the apocalypse. It's very future focused, present phobic, and very ahistorical. So what we're trying to do is root ourselves in that deeper historical context so we can be in this present moment and not keep trying to get to what's coming, what's coming, what's coming. So that's the second piece of this. And the third piece to say before Alnoor can expand upon this is to recognize that these post-capitalist realities that we're invoking exist right now. There are sets of communities and indigenous peoples that have lived some of these values, and in fact have had to, when you said before that it hasn't been so bad, I felt like, whoa, it hit my heart hard, because I was thinking of many of the people who have had to live with this duality and this annihilation of the commons, stamping out of animate, stamping out of like the interconnected ways of being since first contact. And so in some ways they have been living these post-capitalist realities, in some cases for hundreds of years. Others that we can point to, you know, there's different communities that Hakeem Bey would call temporary autonomous zones. So we borrow that language to recognize that there are those that are trying to live outside and are living these temporary autonomous zones, such as Rojava and the Kyrgyzstan movement, such as the Zapatistas of what they've been doing, and other groups that Alnoor and I have the honor to be entangled with that are existing in Colombia, in Brazil, and in other places throughout. Primarily, it's often in the geopolitical South or other spaces that are these sites of not just resistance, but living this set of values. Alnoor, do you want to add to that?
I'll just say first that was a real onto shift for me, and we'll come on to that. Just contemplating, indigenous communities, indigenous peoples, indigenous economies as a form of like living currently existing post-capitalism. I think I've been personally associated post-capitalism kind of with a dash and something more about like solar punk and these kind of, you know, like something more kind of high tech and in the future and so on. So it was really useful just to say, wow, no, like they're right here. And that I think like is very useful for just helping us understand what you mean by it. You know, post-capitalism, is it informed by like that these indigenous peoples are creating livelihoods, creating, you know, lives informed by capitalism while simultaneously resisting it, finding alternatives to it. And also, you know, well, hopefully in a way, hopefully it is also what comes after at some point, you know, and or maybe we could say almost inevitably as neoliberal capitalism unravels. What a gift! What an incredible source of hope that we see actually there are indigenous communities that we can look to and learn from, as things fall apart. But Alnoor, I'll let you pick it up from here.
Maybe just to say that, like a simple way I think of this is that the logic of globalized totalitarian neoliberalism is one of monoculture, right? If we let the system play out its logical outcome, we would all be wearing Nike shoes and clothes made in sweatshops, and eat Monsanto GMO foods and have Apple computers and Microsoft Office and be listening to Beyonce or whatever corporate capitalism wants us to listen to. And the antidote to monoculture is polyculture. Many ways of knowing and being, many ways of seeing, sensing, relating to the world, many tongues, many approaches. And so when we invoke post-capitalism, part of what we're saying is like there isn't going to be another ism, another kind of totalizing system that two smart white Europeans go into a room, the Marx Engels model, and sort of come up with the liberation of the proletariat or whatever. That it's going to be localized, autonomous, bioregional communities. And this is part of the reason we look to indigenous resistances and communities like the Zapatistas in Mexico and Rojava in Kurdistan, who are living these post-capitalist realities. And the reason they're so important is that when we say informed by, they're good students of their culture because they've had to be, right? They've been face to face with imperialist dominator cultures like Western European and North American cultures, and also geopolitically located in the South, like Australia and New Zealand and Japan and other industrial nations. And so they've been face to face with these cultures, and they see the impoverishment of those cultures. They see the bankruptcy and the spiritual, moral, creative impoverishment of those cultures. And they use that to inform themselves on how then shall we proceed. And you were talking about solar punk and other things. We're not saying that these other approaches won't have some role, but we think of this as like new, ancient, emerging, that we're entering this age of consequence, where 5,000 years of pillage and rape and destruction and genocide and resource extraction are coming to a head, right? That we're in this sort of period of reckoning, and we don't know what the roadmap is going to be. We have no idea what systems will take place in order to weather ecological collapse, species extinction, sea level rising, ecosystem degradation, and all the rest that's coming down the pipeline. And so that we're going to have to create syntheses and syncretic traditions of sorts. And of course, they're going to need leadership and eldership from cultures that have unbroken symbiotic lines with the natural world. And we're also going to have to innovate and use our ingenuity to create these new emerging ancient systems. There's a line in the book that where we say, if you do not have a critique of capitalist modernity, you are contextually irrelevant. But if all you have is a critique, you become spiritually and creatively impoverished. So we have to understand the sickness of the dominant culture in order to be contextually sensitive and contextually relevant. And we also have to go beyond the critique to move into these creative and spiritual alternatives and ways of living that are Gnostic, that are in direct relationship to a wisdom greater than ourselves.
So in terms of that moving beyond, maybe now is a time to raise the 5 elements mandala, which is this beautiful framework that you've constructed to present a really like holistic sense of what post-capitalism could be, or the kinds of things that it includes, that it speaks to. I might even bring it up on my screen as you both speak to it, so people can just appreciate its visual form as well. Who would like to start speaking to the 5 elements mandala?
Maybe Lynn.
Yeah,
I'll type out this.
yeah, you can type and I can start on this. And maybe this is a moment to just say that in the book, we had the incredible honor to work with artists and designers and others as we were really endeavoring to ourselves, like make a book that encapsulates this notion of what we're speaking of with onto shifts. And so this is a depiction of, in a way, what you were asking about what we're invoking with post-capitalism. This is Alnoor's and mine kind of subjective view of how do we transition out of systems rooted in domination and exploitation, and how do we work on transition pathways to life-centric ways of living, being, and knowing. And so this 5-element mandala was, in the book, we were looking specifically towards philanthropy and wealth holders as kind of the upstream. Our culture is very sick with the disease of accumulation and hoarding. And how do we actually liberate capital in these times before as Alnoor often will say, before the day the dollar dies, or while we still have this wealth, how do we liberate it in service of life? So we went with a mandala because it's a journey in and a journey out. And so we really look at this mirroring this fractal nature of the inner and outer journey. And so we can start with what we've been speaking to a little bit over on the left of the water. And so there's this connection between the water element and the fire element. That's this axis that we talk about called restoration. And on the water piece, we're speaking to solidarity with Indigenous peoples who are often protecting many of where the world's biodiversity is in the forests, who have sometimes intact lineages where, we have elders that we have the honor of being in relationship with who still speak the animate language that is many fewer nouns and much more verbs. And that's important in terms of the animate way of living and knowing. And we speak about this with examples of what the work is that you can see here up on the screen. And what I want to point to in this moment is why we talk about on this axis solidarity. We recognize with what we were speaking about before with this disease of wetiko, what is it actually to have to do our inner work to know what it is to walk in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. So it's not reifying, it's not glorifying, it's not what I see in the state that I come from, the state of California, that is, oh, we need traditional ecological knowledge for now our fire mitigation. So we're going to take what you've done and put it into all of our biodiversity and all of our practices. So we now have a state policy. That's another form of exploiting and transactionalizing rather than actually walking in solidarity to do the deeper restorative work of restoring our relations with life, getting into reciprocity and kinship. So that's this left side. The right side of that same axis is the fire element. And this is where we look at that solidarity, that same notion with social movements, and in particularly movements that are being led across the geopolitical South, where the world's majority are often having to navigate the consequences of capitalism and exploitation in a daily way, whether it's the lack of water, whether it's like the lithium mining contracts that are going like crazy in Bolivia and other places. So here we're speaking about how capital can be used to buttress and to walk in solidarity with the social movements. So you can see some of the various notions that we're speaking to here. And so if you look at that axes as restoration and solidarity, this is also what is necessary to return energy back into the soil, if you will, so we can work on the other axes, which is the one that we call transformation, like moving into a state change, an alchemical state change, and creation. And so at the top of that is what Alnoor was speaking of before, of the creation or creating new ancient emerging cultures. And here we're looking at like, what is it? As we did the research for the book, it was striking that we spoke to so many people, and there's a sincere dearth of the collective imaginary of what are ways that we can live some of these values that we are invoking with post-capitalism. And we recognize that there's a need for narrative work and hacking and working at the memetics. There's a need for artists to come together who often have this visionary way of seeing what could be, working with educators and shamans and kind of dreaming this air element, this vision state of what new ancient emerging cultures could be. And that the base of that transformational and create access is the earth. And this is where Alnoor was speaking a little bit about what is it to create post-capitalist infrastructure. And here we're looking towards bioregional sovereignty, education, health, cultural sovereignty, that actually is what we often think of in this material form, those things that are actually getting outside of the nation state, or where we're moving into corporatocracy or some dystopia AI future. This is where we're looking at what is it and how resources can actually flow now for not ownership of land, but to support bioregional food, cultural, water, health, education, cultural sovereignty. So, and at the center of all of this in the mandala is the element of ether. And here we're speaking about recultivation life force itself. And so when we look at what the condition of this cancer of Wetiko, what the condition of hundreds, thousands of years of exploitation have done, in a way it has separated us out of actual work to be in the dance with life force, to be, and when I say eros, I'm not just speaking sexual energy, I'm speaking of that which every bee, every flower, every tree is in relationship with. And so here we're pointing to work with trauma and reconciliation. And I want to say that when we're speaking about trauma, it's not just to transactionalize it, to work on our trauma so we can be better citizens in modernity. It's both acknowledging the wound and the epigenetic lineages of this, and it's also sometimes honoring the gift of that puts us back into right relationship with life and death. This is where we see resurgence of mystery schools, rites of passage work, many different ways of being and knowing that are cultivated. And we see this at the heart of this whole mandala, because it's not just that you can go, if say I'm a wealth holder, to say, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to purport that I am in solidarity with Indigenous people and here's the monies. What we're also trying to point to is this ontological change, this way of working that's humbling ourselves with. It's what we do, but it's the manner by which we approach it, how we do it. That is part of what we're trying to point towards in this mandala.
Thank you so much, Lynn. What a fantastic tour of this beautiful form that you've created there. And I see actually it happens that the last bullet point on the last thing that you addressed was as a possible area of work, psychedelic medicines, especially those rooted in traditional cultures, which seems like a pretty perfect segue then to the kind of other part of this talk. But I just pause just to see if Alnoor's got anything to add on the mandala before we move on.
No, I think that's a great summary. Thank you, Lynn.
Yeah. Okay, great. So yeah, let's pick up that thread then. And here the conversation is framed around this piece, why the psychedelic renaissance is just colonialism by another name, which doesn't pull its punches. I mean, appropriately so, I think, and it's raises some really important questions for this for the so-called psychedelic renaissance, and certainly the kind of like psychedelic capitalism, psychedelic corporatism that we're seeing emerge. So Anna, let's see. The first question we had here was just in what ways can we question the idea of a renaissance in psychedelics?
Yeah, I go into detail in this, and I co-wrote this piece with a brilliant man named Rene Sousa, who's part of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, and I highly recommend reading some of their frameworks and. And it comes back to really this notion of like, if we don't have a critique of capitalist modernity, we are contextually irrelevant. And I would say that the psychedelic industry, by and large, is contextually irrelevant. It's simply another branch of neoliberal expansionary logic, and the kind of marketization of psychedelics as a sort of salve, as a kind of quick fix for the woes of capitalist modernity, is going to just amplify the problems and the delusions of the current operating system. That's the upshot. That's not to say that there's still not some benefit that will come, but a key part of the argument in the book is around ontological shifts, right? And ontology is just a fancy word for saying the kind of isness of the world, right? It's the philosophy of being. Onto coming from the Greek being, sometimes interpreted as vision. So the way in which we see and relate to the world, what we decide is so-called real. So the manner by which we approach is more important than what we think we are approaching. And it's actually determined by how we approach. And so it's more of an animistic, relational, quantum queer worldview that we're sort of moving towards in this ontological shift, right? We're moving away from materialist, rationalist, separatist, dualist, positivist, let's say, can be proven, to this kind of animistic, everything is alive, relational, that there's no objective truth, there's only the quality of relations, to paraphrase David Abram. Quantum, in the sense that our very gaze co-determines reality, and there's non-locality and a whole set of factors that the Occidental mindset, the linear problem-solving mindset can't account for, and queer in the sense that there's a blurring and reality stranger than not only we can understand, but that we can imagine, to use the old Haldane line from philosophy of science.
So I think what you're pointing to there is that much of this kind of current psychedelic renaissance, this emerging psychedelic capitalism or capitalist industry, has zero interest or not even kind of awareness of the idea of an onto shift and the kind of, and promoting the kinds of shifts that you've just spoken to there. Actually, I think the question was, was also linked to something else, which was just the idea even of a renaissance that is rebirth in psychedelics, when actually, like, they've had pretty much unbroken use by many indigenous cultures for several thousand years. Nothing is being reborn so far as those of surviving cultures are concerned. I think what you say in the article is, like, at most what is being reborn is a kind of like failed psychedelic revolution of the 70s. So I just wondered if you have a few words on that.
Yeah, it's such a Eurocentric lens, right? That somehow the world must be going through a renaissance because this young, prepubescent, immature civilization is starting to understand what a mushroom is, right? It's so laughable, right? There's been thousands of years of symbiosis with entheogenic plants, and what happened in the West is this sort of like very short, disrupted blip of experimentation that gets shut down by the patriarchal, insecure father overlord of the state. And then psychedelics go underground for 30 years. And when they appear again, it's through venture capital firms and biotech companies trying to isolate alkaloids, right? And to try to get the benefits of the plants without having the full experience of the plants. And in order to solve the psychosis and dis-ease that comes from the very way in which we live. And so, it's that old Marx line, first tragedy and then farce. That's an apt description of the state of psychedelics in the West.
Right. Yeah. So this is actually one of the later questions, but let's follow this thread now then. So it mentions this the attempts by some companies interested in the therapeutic potential of psychedelics to remove the spiritual and visionary components. I'm interested if one of you wants to speak to some of the dangers that you see in that, but I'll also just put something else out there, which is I think that's part of or one class of problems. I think another class of problems is companies that might not be seeking to do that, but are seeking to simply have a reduce costs to actually dangerous levels. I've read about this most recently, actually, in the context of ketamine, which of course isn't a plant medicine, but is we could say it can be an entheogen when used in the correct context. Ketamine being sent mail order to people that have just had a 5-minute consultation with a kind of a doctor online or something like this, and getting into real problems because they haven't received sufficient education on the proper use of that substance. So curious if you wanted to speak to those two problem areas and anything else that you see emerging at this time.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say something about the isolation of alkaloids. Well, look, I think the bigger issue, the isolation of alkaloids is a symptom of a particular ontology. And the particular ontology is that we are entitled, as Westerners, to extract historical, traditional, cultural knowledge of wisdom-keeping traditions, and that we are entitled to commodify plants and fungi to alleviate our psychological, spiritual ennui and trauma. And that entitlement is the source logic of neoliberalism. And what I would argue is that what will come of that is a direct result of how we approach the relationship, like any other relationship. And so there might be some short-term healing, and there is going to be long-term devastation. Everything from creating unsustainable growth trajectories for these plants to psychotic breaks from people who are taking these plants without an embedded cultural context. And like unsupervised, unparented children, every attempt to grasp more creates more drama and more trauma. And that's the cycle we're in. And so, yeah, some people will get benefits, some people will, achieve states of enlightenment. And what I'd say is, like, consciousness is temporary, right? When we, especially when working with plant medicines, right? This is not equivalent to sitting in a dark cave for 40 days and manually, endogenously releasing DMT in your body through meditation, mantra, yantra, tantra, etc. Like, this is not equivalent. What they're great at is shortcutting those experiences so our body can get cellular reminders of what those states are like in order for us to build back our own scaffolding. And so they provide some organic scaffolding, and then there's work to do. And so if we don't have a cultural context in which we have elders, in which we have intact cultures worthy of the word culture, and we don't have ancient relationships that can be mediated by people who understand how to best integrate this knowledge, then we get these like short-term blips of consciousness that appear as almost like manic depressive bouts and episodes. And so what psychedelics can also do is amplify our delusions. And so, if you enter psychedelic space with, well, I paid $300 for this ceremony, and therefore I must get my 2 purges and my 4 insights, and the way Westerners approach ceremony, what it's going to do is it's going to amplify your existing ontology. So unless there's parallel decolonization work and deprogramming and deconditioning happening as active spiritual political praxis, we're just going to replicate the same old shit. And that's what we're doing, right? And then people will say, well, ayahuasca told me to create my own nutraceutical company. And, because of course, a Silicon Valley person who only understands commodification, entrepreneurship, and the VC model is going to see the world through that lens, a man with a hammer and all of that. And so I think this is part of why I think self-reflexivity and accountability and responsibility and sobriety are necessary preconditions to enter a merger with plant consciousness, because they are deities and they are gods, and we have to understand the etiquette and the decorum of approaching a deity accordingly.
Just since it's quite a hot topic in the industry right now, as far as I understand it, and I think since you mentioned in the article, just any words specifically on this this attempt to try to remove like the spiritual, visionary, like entheogenic component of the substances, so that they just have their kind of medical therapeutic effect. It sounds like a bizarre idea to me, but do you, like,
yeah, it's the logical outcome of a prepubescent mindset, right? It's the equivalent of, it's the Diet Coke logic. Let me get all the benefits without any of the calories, right? And the most interesting part of the entheogenic experience is to enter altered states. Like that's the whole point, right? The physical, psychological benefits, especially to indigenous cultures, these were tertiary, right? These were the result of ontological shifts, right? As we said earlier, right? Culture is an agreed upon set of delusions, but it's totalizing, right? So we're all kind of stuck in the machinations of dualism and separation and materialism. And so the aim is to get to non-ordinary state in order to see culture, and in order to see also the culture of ourselves, which is identity, right? Small s self, ego, identity, and transcend, at least temporarily, that ego and that culture, so you could have this larger vantage point. You can access the cosmic mind, would be the kind of idealist way or panpsychist way to think of it. And then re-enter a more mature, sober human being, right? The point of psychedelics was to grow up, not to have a trip. And so, because part of the sort of misunderstanding of the Western mindset is like, well, the trip is the problem. And so you have this weird bifurcation where some people are like trip junkies, and then the kind of sober rationalists want to avoid the trip. And it's like, neither of those are the point. The disorientation from visual effects, from the more psychedelic aspects, was to disrupt the patterns of normality in order for us to have a better grasp of a living, animate universe and cosmos that is stranger and more complex and more queer than we can understand. And so I just, again, see it as this, with both, a sense of like humor and ridiculousness, but also like empathy and sympathy for the sickness of our culture.
Maybe I'll just add a few pieces of, I just feel it so deeply. Our culture is so addicted to comfort. And in this case, even the trip can be uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, it's looking for greater ease of the anxiety, greater ease of the depression, greater ease of whatever it is. And all of that is an addiction to comfort. And we're so addicted to the way that we see the phenomenological world, like the forms. So it's all like, can I make this feel better with how I'm navigating this? And what I feel about this, what Alnoor is speaking to, is when I really sit with, what does it mean to actually transcend subject-object relations? There's such a vastness that opens in me, and me is even the wrong word at the end of that. There's such a, I can't even say the high state of humility, because what I recognize is that my ego is so caught in some sort of hubrisness that it's still trying to grasp at. It's like the 4-year-old crack addict ego that we're all kind of caught in. And when I'm listening to this about, the movement for psychedelics, what I feel like Alnoor is saying is that it both gives us access point to find how we continue down the path of other ways of being and knowing and living. And then it's the work for us to be doing it, not just when we're engaging with these medicines, but in each and every day to access that state of being. So when they're trying to extract that out, it's just such a cosmic joke of where we are in our attachment to form in the phenomenological world of comfort and certainty, in a way. Like, let's let's get it to where we know what the trip is going to be and what it isn't going to be. And then my chemistry, I can now I can come back down to the component parts and relationships to this outcome I'm really trying to run after.
Maybe I give a very specific example, right? For example, San Pedro and peyote both have the active ingredient of mescaline, right? That's the main alkaloid. Anyone who's had the honor of merging with the consciousness of both of these plants will know that the deity of peyote is a very particular relationship, right? You are in communion with the grandfather, you're entering a state of cosmic consciousness, that the God itself is so big that it can't be contained, right? And then you'll have a relationship with San Pedro, and San Pedro is more like the young prince. You know, it's activating your highest self. There isn't the same kind of grandfather energy where you ask questions and receive answers. It's more like your inner knowing gets activated. So same active alkaloid, two completely different deities. And then if you have extracted mescaline, which I've had as well, you know, it can be a great experience, but it's not even in the close to the magnitude of experience of a peyote or a San Pedro experience. And that these plants are not just the sum of their parts in this mechanistic, materialistic way, that, you know, there's combinations of harmine and harmaline and all sorts of other alkaloids and even non-alkaloids that play important, you know, we're talking hundreds of millions of years of evolution and co-evolution with human beings to create a sophisticated, complex plant teacher. And to believe that you can extract one part of it that we've scientifically deduced as the most important part is insanity.
But my experience of kind of plant medicines versus kind of extracted or synthesized versions is that often the synthesized or extracted versions have been kind of more like acutely intense, like more acutely visual or kind of like somatic and so on, not all the time, but usually. And they're very often, like my ceremonies with the plant teachers themselves are in some ways more gentle, but now I see in no way less powerful, and particularly in the temporal aspect. Like now I'm kind of familiar with the pattern of when I'm due to participate in ceremony. Like the ceremony is working like weeks before and weeks after, and it's although it might not be as intense, like in, you know, for those few hours, like if we instead see the ceremony as something that is unfolding over a much longer period of time, then yeah, my experiences, the plants are like are certainly kind of like more intense and more powerful, more profound, and more healing. So yeah, I think there's a question of like, well, yeah, what, like where are we looking here, and what, like, how, you know, and
this is a key point that you're making, right? Again, the reductionist worldview, the atomized worldview, is that somehow it's just the plant. But of course, the ceremony, the ritual, the sacredness of the space, the elder, the curandero, the curandera, the shaman, what have you, that they are bringing a huge component of this relationship to life, right? And that the Icaros, for example, the songs that are sung in an ayahuasca ceremony, like that is the technology, because you have someone who's dedicated their entire life to being an emissary for these plants, who knows how to activate the right aspects of them, right? And that can only be done in a ceremonial container. And just like the plant itself is a deity with its own consciousness, part of the reason it is more gentle is because it is merging with your consciousness, and it knows how to give you what you need. And the problem with the West is, like, we think we know what we want, but we don't even know from whence our desires come, right? We're exposed to 3,000 ads a day and you know, state, military, corporate propaganda, and all of that, right? The cultural conditioning is so deep that we should not be in a position where we decide what we think, what we want, because we're not very good at it, right? We wouldn't let you know, a 7-year-old make all the decisions in the household, and it's the same thing. So, yeah.
This has been such an amazing discussion, and I'm seeing that time is really getting on. So I think very shortly we should open it up to Q&A. I'm just going to take one last look at this list of questions just to see if there's any kind of other big things that we've missed. So the remaining things that we didn't touch on so much were, what are the 5 Ds of dialogue, decommodification, decriminalization, decolonization, and decentralization that together form an alternative to psychedelic colonialism? And how do we contribute to reciprocity when we engage with plant teachers and their ancestral custodians? So just any final words on, on one or both of those points, and then we'll open to questions.
Yeah, I can put the link for this article back in. I think a lot of it is self-explanatory in the article, and so I won't go into like we could have deep arguments about decriminalization, but I think the more important thing here is that there's this old Vedic line that says our work should never exceed our practice. Our work should never exceed our practice. Well, if psychedelics are the practice, the work is decolonization, deprogramming, deconditioning, especially at this point in time when we have incarnated in the Kali Yuga, the Dark Ages in the Vedic tradition, or the Anthropocene, or late stage capitalism, however you want to see it. The Buddhists would call it the age of degeneration, the Hopi, the time of the sixth sun, the Iroquois, the time of the seventh fire. Like we are in this moment where human ignorance has negatively affected every aspect of Earth's biome. That doesn't mean that there aren't some human beings who are trying to prevent that. And of course, agency is not equally distributed, right? 92% of all climate emissions have come from the global north in the last 250 years. But we are in this very particular moment in history, and we need to become good students of our culture in order to be worthy of interacting and engaging with these plants. We are not entitled to the consumption of these plants, especially if we've not been the traditional stewards of these plants. There's a Sufi proverb that we reference in the book a couple of times as well, and it's often attributed to the great mother speaking to her children. And she says, "You are entrusted with everything and entitled to nothing. You are entrusted with everything and entitled to nothing. You're entrusted with the great bounty of life, with oxygen, with abundance, but you're not entitled to any of it. It's a relationship of reciprocity and gratitude and humility." And the Western mind is going to be like, well, how do I solve the problem? And how do I continue to consume, but do it in a more ethical way? And then we'll do all sorts of stupid shit, like invent social capitalism or social entrepreneurship or whatever the thing is. And it's more like, well, just bow your head to the soil and ask for how to be in right relationship. Like, it's not going to be a logical answer. It's not going to come from some axiomatic theorem. It's going to come from deep humility and reciprocity and gratitude to the living world.
Lynn, any final words from you before we open up to questions?
Just as Alnoor was saying all of this, what kept coming to me is, this piece of what is the draw for so many towards psychedelics. And it's, I can look in my own life, when has been that draw? And it's like something feels broken or that needs to be fixed. And so I'm looking to something. And if I actually am really honest about that, I'm saying something's fixed, and so will you save me? And that whole thing just encapsulates our obsession with the savior complex that goes right back to the very history that Alnoor and I were speaking to, the introduction of dualism, and that introduction of dualism that brought about kind of the project of save and extract. And so at the deepest level, it's being really honest with ourselves and endeavoring to have a spiritual practice that allows us to recognize when we're trying to get something, we're transactionalizing rather than just being in deep communion with all.
Wow, thank you both. I really appreciated those last words. I mean, we still have some time for questions now, but yeah, huge gratitude for all that you've shared so far. So yeah, we're lucky to have we're 25 people in total on this call, and it's now your chance to make comments or questions. So probably easiest is if you raise your hand on Zoom using the reactions button there. I see Eleanor, you've already put your hand up, so please go ahead.
Hiya, Lynn and Alnoor, thank you so much for that. I haven't been in a call like this for a long time, and it feels really rejuvenating and exciting to hear your words. When you were talking about the extraction of active elements from plant medicine to be used outside of the whole plant, it reminded me of kind of the sensations I've had before of the extraction of active, and when I mean that, like well or unwell parts of the body or mind from the whole body or mind in healthcare systems, or even in kind of physical sensual relationships. And I'd be really interested if you could both talk a little bit about your research and work in relation to the body and in relation to embodiment, if you're able to do that.
Lynn, you want to go?
I can start. So I have interesting history. When I was I'm a kind of accidental academic and then more accidental former philanthropoid, working in philanthropy, which is how we came to this book. And when I was in graduate school, I was really motivated by activism and deep questions about social change, and studied social movement theory and a whole bunch of pieces with that. And then worked at a foundation where you're entrusted with a whole bunch of resources to try to enact movements. And there's a whole bunch of problematic with all of that. But to this particular question, I resigned for a whole bunch of, I can't even say reasons. It was a inner knowing. It was spirit. And what I did when I resigned was I went and studied somatics, and I went and did a year-long study of a system of human movement. And part of that was deeply recognizing that we had a mind-body split, and that we didn't actually understand embodied cognition, but that's still trying to grasp it in some way for the phenomenological. And I just had it kind of came through a ceremony I did fasting in the desert that said to me that if I don't understand this vessel, if I don't actually start to get more awareness and more preciseness about how this is speaking, I'm still in the split of this is a body and this is the natural world. And so it was for me both like really going from the social movement out here needs to go back into the inner movement, so then I can actually understand, and not just with my mind, but live this mind-body connection innerly in all my relations, in the way that I see culture, institutions, cosmology itself. And then that, of course, takes you on a whole journey of the worlds that start to open. And if I could come back maybe to the economic systems, the other piece of that for me was I got tired of a world that was being defined by either Adam Smith or Karl Marx. And so I was looking to ecology, but I wanted to start with this inner ecology as well to animate how I was seeing complex systems.
Yeah, and I can just add a few things. So a big part of the methodology of the book and the gatherings Lynn and I hold is the idea of like embodied cognition, that our body is not just simply a kind of vehicle for our brain, but it is the sense-making apparatus, and it is not separate from the living world. That it's a fractal. And so Steve Biko, the anti-apartheid activist from South Africa in the 70s said, the base station of capitalism is your mind. And the corollary of that is the base station of capitalism is your body. That the key memes are like the cultural equivalent of genes. The key memes of neoliberalism find real estate in our body. And it's true for all of us, right? Separation from the natural world, hierarchy, the individual as prime unit, rationalism, materialism, competition. They have all found mimetic real estate in our body. So part of the practice is to excavate the body and to integrate the disparate aspects of us, or the parts that have been damaged and impaired by ongoing coloniality. That capitalism and colonialism are neurobiological, cultural, evolutionary impairments that we have to heal. And then this comes back also to the role of psychedelics and any non-ordinary state, whether that's yoga, meditation, tantra, dancing, doing whirling dervish practice, whatever it is, that it's critical that we get to non-ordinary states in order to have a kind of bird's eye or forest view of the delusions, and then to reintegrate that. And that also, there's another Sufi proverb which is considered heretical, where they say the body is the prophet, the desert is the prophet. The body is the prophet, the desert is the prophet. And it's heretical because, of course, in institutional Islam, there's only one prophet. But the idea that the body is the prophet is that our bodies are these, prophetic beings that are deeply connected to the mother. And what's happening in our body is a direct reflection of what's happening in the broader environment, in the ecosystem, and that there's this feedback loop. And this is the dashboard of how we negotiate with ecology. And that the desert is the prophet in the sense that we are not separate to the ecology in which we are embedded, right? The scientists are all trying to figure out the hard problem of consciousness, right? If in their worldview, the brain is just simply neurochemistry and neurocorrelates firing. And so where does consciousness come from? Right, this is called the hard problem of consciousness, which is just inane, it's stupid, it's just circular logic. It created their own problem because of the dualistic belief at the core of it. And in Sufism, what we would say is that Allah is a metaphor for the universe. God is a metaphor for the universe. So consciousness itself is becoming self-aware through us. And the us is a host of bacteria and fungi and a biome and a biome and all these things, as well as our interaction with the ecology, because there is no body separate from the ecology. And so we look around to the health of the ecology to understand the health of our body, right? Because it determines where our water is coming from, the quality of our oxygen, the quality of our food. All of these things are so entangled that the separatist, materialist, rationalist worldview is just laughable. And now science, the younger brother of common sense and the even younger brother of mysticism, is finally catching up to understanding the complexity and the interrelationality between the desert, the ecosystem, and the body, and the prophetic impulse that exists between these two. There's a Christian theologian, Matthew Fox, who says, the only force greater than capitalism is ecology. And I don't know if that's hopeful or not. I don't necessarily believe in hope as a strategy, but there's something in that.
There's one more line that came that my movement teacher offered, which I think gets to the heart of where Alnoor and I were speaking about this life force. And it is that we, as two-leggeds who stand upright, are still negotiating verticality, meaning that we are still in a continual process of this evolving. I want to say it as an ing in the English language, the verbing, that we are still in that current, and that it's our perception, our ontology that somehow separates us out and assumes that this is a fixed structure and that we are not in that current. We could argue whether sitting in chairs and whether, using cell phones has us in a devolving impulse right now, but we're still in a continuum and an engagement with life force itself. So we're still ever negotiating verticality. It's why when people, go and say, like, how do I put my shoulders? It's like, there's not an answer. It's so deep in us, this conditioning of fix and of find the answer for resolution. And yet we're an ing. And so this is the way that it's like the way that we saw this life force and ether is so deep in kind of what gives expression to material form.
Thank you both. Any comments on what you heard, Eleanor? Are you satisfied for now?
It's thrilling, and I feel physically excited by the responses, and it's wonderful to see connections made between things that are so important to me as an embodiment practitioner, and as I would ecologically aware person is probably the closest I would say to anything, but to have that drawn out and the lines drawn, and to know that that is work that's occurring, it feels wonderful to engage with that, and just to know that that's something that I can reach for.
Thank you. See, Michael's got his hand up, so yeah, let's move on to your question, Michael.
Thanks, folks. Firstly, what a staggering contribution to the Rebel Alliance you guys have made. So thank you very much. And secondly, I suppose, so I work more at the interface between these ideas and mainstream audiences. So I've been reading your book and making lots of notes about how I might try and articulate the ideas that you've been expressing and articulating for people who haven't even been through the first gateway of initiation into some of these ideas and concepts. But the question I'd like to share here is a question that actually came from someone I know who works in the philanthropy space when I forwarded on your website to them, that I thought I'd actually just share here on her behalf. And the first thing was she had massive big ups for the fact that you resigned from a foundation as a conscientiousness objector, which is such a bold move. And she was also really curious to read reviews of the book from other philanthropists or people working in that space, because she said so far she could only see sort of reflections from authors or academics or activists. And I was just curious to hear how your thinking is landing, whether you have presented it to people sort of working in the system in philanthropy and how it's received by them. Curious on how it's all landed.
You want to start?
Can I start on this one, Alnoor, or do you want to start? Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for the just kind of honor the work of when people are working at the intersection of many different kinds of ecologies and diversities, and finding the way to find common ground and what is it that can bring us together in the inquiry. And I heard that very much in what you're doing as well. So what you might call mainstream philanthropy, Alnoor and I didn't write this book with any kind of with any way that the strategy or theory of change would be thought of in that lexicon. We very much wrote this in the way of this is a prayer, and we're going to offer this to those who have resonance and see how this moves. And so the first, where it's moving is fascinating, like what you're speaking. It's moving to kind of the activists, some of the academics, some of people who are interested in what we might call post-capitalist realities. And what I've been noticing from former colleagues and friends is that they're either kind of in the first section, just trying to really look at their inner structures and what they're doing in each moment. So there's kind of that response of like, holy moly, now I have to do like almost my own truth and reconciliation commission of that I'm still sitting within this institution, accepting the 5% payout rule and just kind of moving it along. So there's that kind of an initial grappling. Then there's those who are in philanthropy who have been engaged in, let's say, the decolonizing work of philanthropy and the justice work. That there's been a response of, okay, we see you, and how do I actually take in what you're asking of these ontological shifts? So that way there's something about the way that I'm approaching this work that wants to start changing. And that's an ongoing praxis. You know, there's in that piece of the book that we're sitting with, a dear beloved ally and brilliant Nigerian philosopher says, you know, justice will get us a seat at the table, but will never let us leave the house of modernity. It takes a while to actually work with that. If you're sitting within the institution of philanthropy and you're seeing such extreme need every single day in the whatever issues that you are working on. So we're seeing from there questions about how can we engage in a deeper praxis or pedagogy, or how can we actually sit with this material so we can kind of go through what's needed innerly to see then how I work. So it's that everything to, I won't say a large step, but I will say a few foundations that have come to us. And Alnoor and I also do gatherings, in-person gatherings, to really sit with this inner and outer work and the spiritual and political praxis. And through that, there have been some foundations that say, okay, I really resonate with these premises and everything. So they're in the process of, for lack of a better expression, hospicing the entire foundation, the endowment, the grant making, everything in an endeavor to get us out of this paradigm itself during this moment of the collapse. So there's mixed responses, and it's at different stages, if you will. And the other piece that Alnoor can also speak to is that we're starting the process of writing some op-eds and some articles to try to move different pieces of this in like a Stanford Social Innovation Review or others. So we're actually we're speaking more directly to some of these more traditional foundations, and I would say kind of being more provocative. My beloved mystical anarchist brother is really, really great at wielding the sword of egoic structures and memetics. And so some of that is kind of the prayer that we're doing, is like, where can we find how to, not just with information, but the ontology that we're bringing that's going to pierce. What I feel in philanthropy is there's a lot of Teflon, there's a lot of protection layers. We may take information, or you may tell us everything we're doing wrong, but internalizing that, so there's actually a difference of behavior, a difference of responsibility, is a very long process. And so we're trying to find myriad ways to move that forward. Long-winded answer, because there's not a straightforward one.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say, well, I'll start with a personal story, which was I read Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus when I was 12 years old, and it had this huge influence on me. And I sort of, you know, as a naive 12-year-old, I made this vow. I was like, I'm not going to write anything till I can write like Camus in The Myth of Sisyphus. And so I was very resistant to ever write a book. Because, you know, of course, no one can write like Camus in The Myth of Sisyphus. Even he couldn't write like that again. You know, it's a sutra. It's like a sort of high text, maybe the kind of definitive text in the Western philosophical canon. And then, you know, when we closed the rules in 2019, it only was going to live for 8 years. Transition Resource Circle was part of that. It was one of the projects of the rules. And Lynn and I held this gathering at the end of 2019, and then I went into a 17-month sabbatical. I was still working, but no income. I wouldn't take any funding, and so Lynn and I were sitting with okay, we'll see what's ours to do. And then these funders started like requesting accompaniment, and then can you write some of the things that came up in the gathering? Can you put some of this down? And then it sort of, Lynn and I sat in a dieta together. A dieta is it's almost like a vipassana with plant medicine in a Peruvian Shipibo tradition. And so it's 2 weeks of silence, no eye contact, 1 meal a day. And we sort of came out of that, and I got this very clear message: it has to be a book. And I was super resistant, So Lynn will remember I kind of came to her as soon as we could speak, and sat on her mat, and I'm like, fuck, it's going to be a book. And the last thing I ever wanted to do was write a book on philanthropy, on one level, like, who gives a shit? And on another level, like my background was as an activist and as an organizer and a political strategist. I realized that all the funding for social movements, the upstream, is the philanthropic industrial complex. That they basically decide on the agenda for civil society, and it's this huge sector, right? It's like, just in grant making, not endowments, it's like something like $2.2 trillion in the last measurement a couple of years ago, which is like the size of Canada's GDP. It's like a G7 country. That is totally obscure and obfuscated and not transparent. And so, when we wrote this book, my position on these things is like, I don't really care if funders read it or not. It's like, if it shifts someone's perspective, great. And if it doesn't, would we do anything different? Probably not. Like, we have a karmic spiritual obligation to write what we know, and in a way that feels true to us, the complex of beings that we are, the bacteria in our body, our ancestors, our epigenetics, and all of that. And so we put it as an offering. And it's interesting to see that a lot of activists have taken to the book, maybe in some ways more than funders, and then they sort of use that as ammunition and leverage for their funders. And so funders end up reading it, but it's usually given to them. It's kind of against their will. We have a lot of funder activists who will get 20 or 50 copies or whatever, and distribute it to boards of big foundations. But privilege is a constraint, right? Privilege is a very deep constraint. You can't see what you can't see. Privilege constrains also your empathy, your desire to go outside of your traditional knowns and your certainties. And so we deal with all of that. And in some ways, we're more in the trust and the prayer that it'll get to who it needs. And I probably wouldn't read a review of the book anyways, myself. And so, yeah, it's just, it's a matter of how do you perceive what you're doing? I don't feel any sense of attribution or we wrote the book, or no, it's it's a synthesis of lots of other people's thinking, and it's an offering you put into the world as a prayer. And if it resonates, great. And if it doesn't, equally great, yeah.
You want to follow up on that at all, Michael?
I would, but I'm in a really quiet space.
Okay, no worries. Well, I had. Oops, you kind of you touched on it towards the end there, Alnoor, but it made me think of this the drama triangle, as with activists often, or at times at least, in the role of the victim, if you like, and certainly when it comes to relationship with funders. And actually, some of my studies in coaching, I learned a model which is about flipping the drama triangle, where the victim becomes the kind of empowered creative. And I think that's actually one major benefit that the book is having. It's helping kind of activists or people that might be dealing with philanthropists to kind of shift into a different mode of being. I'm not just going there with the begging bowl, but saying, hey, hey, you have a responsibility to our movements, and indeed to all life. And I think that whether or not the philanthropists themselves read it, I think it's already likely to have a massively positive impact just on that side of the equation. The other thing I wanted to pick up was, since you both mentioned it, or it's been mentioned a couple of times now, these in-person gatherings. I have a sense that is could be another very influential stream of works. I'm curious what exactly is going on there, and whether and then also whether you'd like to mention any ways in which the people in this call or in the broader psychedelic society community can stay involved with your work, whether that's in person or otherwise.
Lynn, you want to start?
Sure. So this work that we call just to say for a moment, transition resource circle, transition for everything we've been speaking of, or what we're transitioning out of and towards in the deepest sense of that. Resources, recognizing that we're just holding this prayer of how to liberate wealth and capital. And even at some points when we do an exercise around the deity of money, there is a different piece about what actually is the sovereign will of money itself. So what we're focused on, that resources, and then circle in a sense of that we're looking for other ways of being together, circle ways of being together that are kind of the ancient way that we know, that get us out of hierarchy and power over, power under kinds of ways. So that work was initiated first within the NGO that Alnoor co-founded and ran for a number of years, that was looking to not just conscientize with the political education, but bring in very specifically what we're speaking to, the spiritual and political praxis. So as Alnoor mentioned, we co-guided that transition resource circle in November of 2019 with a small group. And then we did another one. Then, of course, the pandemic hit and it wasn't a time for in-person gatherings. And we did another one last year in May. We actually have one coming up at the end of April, early May of this year as well. And it's a very small group of people who are either funders, wealth holders themselves, inheritors. Sometimes it's like the second generation or the third generation of someone who's come in as an inheritor that is navigating the karmic implications of that and the sickness that's often in their family. And or those who have something that we would call this archetype of like funder activists. Sometimes it's not necessarily in a philanthropy itself, but they have a lot to do with money and its implications. So we do these gatherings small to really go deep and to live what we're speaking here of how do we listen for these transition pathways and the ontological shifts that accompany it? How do we respond to this moment in the Anthropocene, or if you want to speak the language of the Kali Yuga, and what's ours to do within there? And what we haven't spoken to is another kind of mimetic or prayer that Alnoor and I sit with is, if you look at liberation theology and what came out of that, this blending of a political and spiritual moment that gave rise to so many movements and that truly shifted a lot of the peasant movements across so many places in Latin America, and were one of the few instances, like let's just take what Alnoor gestured to before the Bretton Woods Agreement, when the geopolitical South actually had not just influenced, but like reshifted some things. It was this moment that had sticking power. So we sit with like, what are the liberation ontologies of our time? How do we penetrate the mind of the secular, the rationalist, the materialist, and actually listen for what's ours to do? So the gathering is there. We actually this year have a couple of wildcard seats for a few more funders. And we often have done it invitation, like those who we know. And this year we had the impulse to just open it up a little bit more. And so there's an intake form on our website that we'll review for another week or so for those who may want to come and join with us. And the other piece that you're asking about, how can people engage with this work deeper, is I'm going to be working with Service Space, Alnoor will as well, and we will be doing an online, led by Service Space, kind of deepening into the praxis of this work. And so I'm sure there'll be an announcement on our website, but Alnoor and I are kind of Luddites on these things and definitely not into a lot of promotion. So we're always grateful for others who are sharing links and things like that, because we can get the word out. Yeah.
And just to clarify, Service Space is creating like a platform, sort of like Mighty Networks. So they call them pods, like learning pods. And so we're going to do one on post-capitalist philanthropy, mostly for funders and funder activists. And then we might open another one around post-capitalist realities, which will be outside of the funding space, mostly for practitioners, activists, others. And I also sent the link for the events page in the chat box, and there's a webinar series, and we just wrote a bit about that. So if you're interested, it's a free open webinar.
Nice. I'll take this opportunity also to mention some of the knowledge graphing work that I've been doing.
Yeah.
Alnoor is one of the people who I've included in this study, if you like, which takes appearances on YouTube and the transcripts, and then detects like most commonly used phrases from that individual and how they link to other phrases. So Lynn, I'll happily do one for you next if there's enough content for of you on YouTube as well. But for the time being, just Alnoor here. So if you want to, some of these terms will be probably familiar to you from today's talk. Others won't be so familiar. But if you want to dig more into Alnoor's thought, you can check that out. I'll put a link into the Zoom chat here. There's a bunch of other things you can pick from, including bio and others. I mean, we're pretty much close to time. I actually have somewhere to be on the hour, so I'm keen to finish just a couple of minutes early myself. And so maybe just give Alnoor and Lynn the opportunity for any closing remarks.
I don't know. I think just to say thank you, Stephen, for taking the time, and gathering a circle, and for all of you for spending a couple hours with us on a Wednesday. Yeah, shukran.
Yeah, Lynn, please. Yeah.
Alnoor and I finished the book with kind of a reflection on where we see some of this moment of how we can walk these transition pathways. And I felt perhaps just to end with that, which is kind of more of a prayer I walk with in my heart, which is, how do we find our way into deep surrender, our ways of being and our ways of knowing, to meet this threshold, this initiatory moment where we are innerly as a species in our cosmology, so we can then walk each other into the unknown, walk each other back into right relationship with life and death and all that ever has been and will be and is in this moment. So in that way, thank you for this time that we've had together to just share and listen. Thank you, Stephen, for reaching out, and may we walk each other through this threshold initiation into the unknown.
Thank you both so much. I just remembered something else, which was some people kindly made donations for this event. They will be passed on to Shipibo-led community organizations, the exact organizations to be confirmed. And just to remind you that this event has been hosted by the Psychedelic Society, which is a not-for-profit worker cooperative. May there be more such organizations flourishing in the psychedelic space in the years to come. I know that's something that you mentioned in your article, Alnoor, but hugely grateful to both of you for all that you've shared today. The time has flown by for me, and I'm so excited to keep track of all the work that comes through you from here. I'm just finding it so rich and energizing personally. Okay, have a wonderful day, everybody. Take care.
Shukran. See you soon.